It's 11:29 a.m. on March 24th, 2021. I'm going to just give a very succinct, as much as I can, recounting of certain events, and then I'm going to make certain statements about what I understand is not only a possibility, but that is already way overdue. When I was in Chicago in 2008, shortly after returning from a time in California where I worked as a cook in a Girl Scout camp, I became involved with an election campaign. And then after the election campaign, I engaged as part of what I had from my past in working with a church in the south side of Chicago that were primarily with people who were undocumented immigrants from Central America. I knew the Padre from when I worked at Streetwise. He was somebody who was an activist in the community who had approached the organization about starting a Spanish language supplement specifically to try to do outreach to people who were first language or solo language Spanish speakers that were homeless. And one of the things he talked about was problems that were being had with day labor agencies and how Streetwise was an alternative or was in some sort of consideration comparable to what people were dealing with from the communities that were primarily Spanish speakers or solo Spanish speakers concerning day labor. This is when I first met him. We parted ways, and over the years, different things happened. And we came back together after he had gone to divinity school, and he became a pastor. And when he was a pastor, he was doing ministry to this community in the south side of Chicago. By that time, I had also had my own understanding of a sort of spiritual catharsis, and I felt a great affinity for him. I understood and believed in what he was doing, not only spiritually, but also politically. One of the things he did is availed himself of what was a constitutional law as well as what was otherwise available, that by virtue of his role as a pastor, he was able to do ministry to people that were in detention centers. And by being able to do ministry to people in detention centers, he was also able to provide them with some access to legal support that would not have otherwise been available. Additionally, the actual site of the church was also identified and designated as a sanctuary site, so that people that were involved in very significant acts of political or other retaliation while they were attempting to appeal what was being identified as being available as a course of action regarding addressing matters related to being in the country without documents, were able to seek sanctuary. And so he, through his ministry, provided sanctuary, and the ministry, the church, the people and the parishioners of the church were also part of providing sanctuary to people that had these kinds of situations. Again, after a certain point in time, he and I were parted. And I went to San Francisco. But when I returned to Chicago, I met with him again. And this time he was in a different location, but he was still doing a similar ministry. He was also doing a different ministry insofar as he was attempting to address factors related to people who did not have legal identification as an American citizen who were in need of organ transplants. And what the point is that he was still maintaining his ministry, which also meant he was still maintaining what was necessary in order for the parish to be available, the actual fixed structure of the parish as well to be available as sanctuary for people that would need such sanctuary. So these are all legal processes. They're also all within the bounds of the constitutional rights we have to freedom of religion. And it's also part of a very long history throughout the Americas of people of faith standing up for justice and taking risk is necessary in order to protect the vulnerable and the innocent, including against persecution, but also against wrongful incarceration. Now, when I went to Houston for the first time, had a different trajectory in mind, but I was exposed very immediately to a situation that was going on with a concurrent process regarding legislation in the state of Texas that was unconstitutional. I did not understand the specifics on the legislative level, or rather the large scale state bureaucratic or administrative level, but I knew what the practical implications were for people that were at the sort of, shall we say, cusp of very high risk of vulnerability by virtue of being on the street or being in a situation where they did not have a sort of stability in their lives, i.e., people that were homeless, including for reasons of domestic violence, but also people that were homeless because they were in a course of trying to address their immigration status. And this is a specific thing that's experienced when you're talking about women headed households. And especially when there is a specific focus on the patriarch in the family or the father, or in some cases, the eldest son in the family, to remove the kind of support that the possibilities for people that are undocumented can obtain in the course of trying to do what they need to do in order to establish the requirements necessary to find a legal basis for gauging the process of citizenship in the United States. I didn't know what the legal wrangling was at the time, but I knew how it was impacting people practically, and I could see and experienced firsthand the completely amoral but also illegal activities that were being done and committed by people in the administration of the municipality of concern, which at first was Houston and then later Pasadena, Texas. Is understand after a certain point in time, after I went to Austin, I also experienced it in Austin. This process whereby people knew that there were certain things they needed to do administratively in order to be legally compliant so that they could do things up to and including participate in processes for legal citizenship and or go through a period of residency in order to establish themselves and or find what they needed to do to maintain themselves legally so that then they would be able to demonstrate that they had a good intent in terms of trying to participate as an American citizen. And in the course of that, they were being blackmailed all over the place in all kinds of ways. And the primary means by which they were being blackmailed was in consideration of a characterization of their child as having some sort of mental problem. And so their child needed to go get medical treatment. And then not only medical treatment, needed to be medicated. And they needed to demonstrate their consistency in acquiring the drugs to medicate their child as being a demonstration of their compliance. Now, this is not just in consideration of factors related to people experiencing domestic violence that are involved in a custody proceeding who are legal citizens of the United States. As a matter of fact, most of the people I encountered, and maybe not over 50%, but a disproportionate amount of the women I encountered that were dealing with this were not at the time citizens of the United States, or they were married to somebody who was born in a foreign country, became a citizen of the United States themselves, and it was because of their marriage to that man that was the primary basis for determining their citizenship was based. So when they were exposed to domestic violence and in these shelters, there were all kinds of machinations and manipulations they were exposed to in the course of trying to demonstrate that they had every intention of being law-abiding and being legal, but they had been exposed to threats of sometimes fatal violence and had need of support. What instead of these moments providing a time for people in civil society to step up and demonstrate their actual commitments, whether it's a faith calling that leads them to seek out a vocation, or whether it's actual employment that is in compunction with what they understand to be their political priorities. These are not supposed to be moments of rampant exploitation systemically, so other people could try to acquire leverage for some sort of bargaining position for their own personal compensation packages. Because when you start doing that at the administrative level, it makes a justification for reifying that all the way up the chain, which gets to why I was addressing the National Petroleum Council today. But I am not talking about that right now. What I'm talking about, what would have been reasonable, legal, legitimate means by which to address this so-called border crisis. It's not a border crisis. This is a premeditated political paradigm posturing. And this has been at least for several years. So I'm just going to recount very quickly what I personally would have done as a response. The first thing I would have done would have started in December 2016. My understanding is that there was already an understanding that there were certain cities, specifically in Texas, that were identified as sanctuary cities, and that there was potentially a consideration of what the city was going to have to do if there was an attempt to colonize the city, or rather to attempt to absorb the autonomous political functionings of the city into another kind of structure, including in a manner that was unconstitutional, but potentially also under the threat of violence. A specific scenario involved in understanding that resource needs such as electricity and water were to be used as leverage in order to try to cowl some sort of political concession from the city. And so, in the course of that, I developed a strategy that I approached from a concept of a potential siege, a potential urban siege. And I used my understanding of what I had geographically, as well as facilities oriented in terms of Houston, to specifically conceive in my mind of what would have been a practical strategy in terms of trying to address how to provide resources for people within the city while also trying to fend off encroachment. Now, at the time, I did not have a cognizance that that was something that was being extrapolated internationally. I literally believed that that was something that was being threatened in Texas. And I did not believe it was coming from south of the border. I believed it was coming from within Texas and within the United States, and that there were people somewhere in Texas that were actually going through considerations of those matters. And so, in the course of so being and being on whatever current it was, that gave me that inspiration. I came up with my own possible nascent strategy. Within 2 months, that email, all that work was completely eliminated from my email. I have no record of what I did. Sometime later, I learned about SB4 and the pending legislation in the legislator from the state of Texas. But the problem with that was that prior to SB4, the governor, the alleged governor at the time, Greg Abbott, had put out a pronouncement that any sheriff or any city that supported sanctuary cities, and he focused specifically on sheriffs that supported the sanctuary cities, was going to be cut off from state resources if they stood behind or backed the policy of sanctuary city for that particular area. And the concern was that there had been sheriffs that had come out. At the time, I believe there was more than 16 sheriffs in the state of Texas who had been elected. I mean, sheriffs are elected. This is different than an appointment from the governor or an appointment from within a city council. They have to run, and not only do they have to run, but they have to establish a particular kind of support that they can both provide and that they can acquire and sustain in the form of acquiring sureties in order for them to be able to perform their position. There's a different bonding process when it comes to sheriffs than there is to constables, and certainly than there is to police officers. And according to the laws of Texas, to go all the way back, we're talking more than 100 years, sheriffs are required to have two sureties. And the specific nature and the substance of those sureties are not things that I am anything close to an expert in. But I do understand and know that they are the kinds of things that are distinct and different for the different law enforcement agencies of any given particular locality. Not only that, sheriffs are specifically charged with protecting the private property of the people within their area. There's a reason why the sheriffs are the ones that serve eviction orders. And this is also a reason why when a sheriff, for instance, as has happened, refuses to serve an eviction order, this is a very, very monumental matter. In the state of Texas, sheriffs do not have constitutional authority to make a determination about the specific law at hand, but they have not only a right, but a duty to apply their own consideration to the application of that law. So if there is a particular dispute in terms of the potential implementation of a law considering their jurisdiction, it is not only their right, but their expectation and duty that they do so. An attempt to encroach upon that means what? Well, if you have the governor that is unilaterally attempting to threaten, or in some cases, threaten to enforce a penalty against the sheriffs for applying the law within their jurisdiction, I contend that there has to be consideration as to the motive. My concern, especially as it has bared out now for about going on 4 years, actually today, it would be 4 years, is that the absolute intention was bond fraud. Fraud involving the bonding for first responders, specifically sheriffs, because they are elected to their post as opposed to being appointed. And the specific matters related to the bond fraud have to do with the authority under which law enforcement operates. Because sheriffs are elected by the people of their jurisdiction, they have a different accountability than a police chief or a Texas trooper or even a constable. And this is something that the governor, especially insofar as he reflects that he has a particular kind of past history of public service, should already know. Now, the legislature should also have known. The legislature should have sanctioned the governor of Texas when he made the pronouncements he made specifically about Sheriff Hernandez and how he was going to target her first and specifically. as a means by which to make an example out of other Texas sheriffs who had decided that they were going to actually do what they're supposed to do, which is apply the law for the area to which they are elected to represent. My concern is and has been ever since I formally attempted to report in June of 2017 my concerns about the implications that the governor, the alleged governor of Texas, was specifically committing fraud against the surety of specific sheriffs with an understanding that if there had been another sort of infraction recorded by the sheriff in performance of their ministerial duties, then it would impact their fiduciary responsibilities as sheriff, which also includes to the people who work for them. When a sheriff takes their bond, when a sheriff provides a bond for their office, it is also impacted by and impacts the safety and the assurance of the people who work for the sheriff's department of that particular jurisdiction. Again, this is different than constables, and again, this is different from the police department. So it's especially concerning if there is a complete refusal to hold police abuse accountable within a particular political subdivision because of the liability and the accountability that the police have, and then instead to intentionally try to target sheriffs who are elected members of law enforcement in the same jurisdiction, which is what happened in Houston and Harris County, at least beginning in 2017 that I was witness to, and that seems to be persisting to this day, and not only in Harris County, by the way. And I say this because the next thing that could have been done could have been that. There should have been a check against the abuse of the governor of Texas in committing fraud involving the bonding of first responders, which also impacted fraud involving municipal bond issues for various political subdivisions involved, including Houston, including Harris County, including Austin, and now including Dallas and the Fort Worth area. That would have been the second thing that could have been done. Now, there are other things that tactically and specifically could have been done in order to address this since 2017. Since 2018, since 2019, since 2020, and certainly now. But the thing is, until we actually address those issues, those are the issues that are actually forestalling anything close to a conscientious, much less legal process by which to address the factor at hand. It may seem like one of these things, it's not as sexy, and it's certainly not as politically provocative. You don't get as much political capital defrauding by understanding it as a structural approach along these lines. But that's what it is, at least and especially in the state of Texas. And then from the state of Texas, one can make a consideration of the legal and constitutional implications for other areas. As I said, I have already come up with several policies. I've already come up with several strategic manners in which this could have been taken out of the realm of political wrangling by opportunists who have failed to deliver now for going on 3 years. Please recall the first time that this started coming up, this border surge crisis started coming up, was in the fall of 2018. There was a very, very specific reason why in the fall of 2018 there was this major political issue in a specific manner that was made of what was going on at the U.S. Mexico border. Granted, these issues have been a part of our realities for a very long time. But this specific hedging strategy should have already been stopped before fall of 2018. It wasn't. Why? Well, because of what has happened since the fall of 2018, specifically at the federal level. Again, what was going on within the state of Texas was part of a pattern of racketeering activity that nobody forestalled and instead attempted to leverage to defraud the federal government. And now it is more than apparent on the level of the federal government, while concurrently alleged state actors in the state of Texas are disabusing their positions of power and compromising public safety.